Misery loves company, but do not let other people's misery suck you in, and don't try to suck other people in. So I want to talk to you about it because there's you've probably heard the saying misery loves company, right? So there's a reason for it. So when you are suffering or struggling or you're mentally in a space, there is this level of comfort that comes from not feeling alone, right? Because in many cases you already feel alone. So you're like, okay, well, I don't feel alone. If I'm miserable and I know that this person's miserable, there's compassion. It's not so much like pity. It's not like, oh, they're pitying me. Oh, they're looking down on me. It's this level of like, oh, we're somewhat equals. And in some weird way, you feel validated, even though it may not be from the person who has hurt you, right? Or situation that has hurt you. But the reality is you have to be you have to be careful, because the misery loves company means sometimes people are not always going to want to see you succeed. They're not always going to want to see you happy, and they're not going to want to necessarily accept you're growing, especially if they're not on that part of the journey. And that's fine. Everybody's on a different part of the journey. It doesn't mean that just because you're on a different part that it's wrong. But there will be people in your life, and unfortunately it could be your closest people, your family, your besties, all of these people who are just the people who just always seem to, like, in their mind, they feel like they can't catch a break. They can't do these things. And so they're looking, right, for somebody to not sympathize, like I said, more compassionate, I guess, have empathy, but be compassionate versus like, well, I don't really understand it and I'm going to keep it moving. But see, that's why you have to be okay with, it's not your job to fix somebody else's misery. It just isn't. And as a person who lived in this mental sort of victim mentality in my teens and early 20s, like you just want somebody to almost like validate you and be like, I'm not alone. And then if you can pull somebody down, you don't realize you're pulling somebody down. But if you can relate to somebody, it seems like more comforting to you, but it's not fair to everybody else, right? When you start to get very clear that your misery is your responsibility to process and it isn't for everybody else to empathize with, it becomes a lot. I mean, it can seem scary and a little bit like, oh gosh, that's terrible. But it's also very freeing, and you have better relationships, because what somebody doesn't want to hear is when you're in that space, that negative space, if you're always complaining, people don't want to hear that. And so you have to be careful of other people. Don't be paranoid, but be careful of people's motives. That's why you don't, if they're in a misery state, that's not a blanket statement. Like, be careful of people's motives. If you see them in this sort of victim state, or in this, the state of just not in a great being, keep a lot of things that you're doing close to the vest. Don't be oversharing. Don't try to over empathize with them. You can be there. But misery loves company because it's there for a reason. So sometimes people try to completely sabotage you. Is it always manipulation? Well, it's always manipulation. Is it always intentional manipulation? Not necessarily. It is manipulation 100% of the times. But what happens is, and that's where you can find yourself doing your own sort of misery, looking at people's financial success from your viewpoint, not realizing what they do to actually get that money, right? The work that they've done versus where you are, right? So then you start almost being like, well, not almost, you start being jealous. In turn, it's almost like in some way you're mad at that person for having it because you're envious of it. And in some weird way, you're like, well, why do they have it and not me? Right? So that goes into that comparison. And that is part of misery loves company. Right? So you have to be really, really careful when you're in that space of falling into what other people's narrative is. And sometimes these people are going to be miserable for a long, long time because they're not willing to accept that it's their responsibility. I wasn't in there that long, probably 7-8 years, long enough for me. Don't recommend the trip. But when you are in that space and you feel like you identify as you're with that person or with that trauma that you still internally have, and you're looking for this validation, it's going to be really difficult for you to have healthy relationships with other people, because you're going to want them to empathize, and then you're going to get mad at them when they don't have empathy and they go, well, okay, listen, like, I hear you. We've talked about this 4 times, but I can't have this conversation with you anymore, right? Because if your mom is always talking about how your dad hurt her 14 years ago, and here we are today, and we keep having this conversation, you don't have to be here for that, right? It's not about being ignorant or being rude, but your boundaries may seem rude to them, and that is okay, because it is not your role to make them feel better when they're not doing the work to feel better, right? Because I'm telling you, like I said, I've lived it, right? And so when you're in that space, it's like you don't like that space. You don't like the feeling, but you know how to live there. It's this comfortable chaos, and you know how to function there. You know how to exist in this chaos. So, and then you have this fantasy world of like, oh, you want to feel better. You want to do better. You want to get better. You want to do those things. You want to do it today. You're not willing to put in the work because a lot of the work you don't want to hear. You don't want to do it because it's going to force you to have to own it yourself. That was probably one of the biggest sort of like smack in the face aha moments for me and on my journey was that, hey, it's your role. It's your responsibility to get through your stuff. And you don't have to bring all these people down with you. And I think that's a really important one, because that is what the whole misery loves company thing is you want somebody to be able to relate to you, and you don't want to feel so isolated. But that's why you also have to be careful. I mean, it's one thing, like if both of you guys broke up with a boyfriend or whatever, and you want to go for drinks or have ice cream or whatever, that's fine. Like if you need that day or whatever, and it's equal, like you're like, okay, it's fine. But don't live there. Every time you guys get together, don't sit there and trash your ex-boyfriends and, yeah, can you believe? No, I can't, because all that does is it feeds the bear, right? If you ever talk to somebody, and let's say you were in a space where you were a little annoyed with something, a little upset, and then you talk to somebody and they're like, yeah, oh my God, you're right. And like they start to gas you up a little bit, and you're like, yeah. And then you get off the phone and you're worse than you were before. You're like, yeah, that's right. Like you start to kind of get a little stressed out. So that's why you want to be careful. When you're going through something, you want to walk through the fire, not around it. I know in theory, in your mind, you're like, oh my God, I don't want to walk through the fire. Yeah, I understand that. But if you don't walk through the fire, you're not going to avoid the fire. The fire's just still going to blaze, and it's going to continue to blaze, and it's going to continue to blaze. Okay. And so make sure yourself, when you're in not a good headspace, make sure that you're not trying to intentionally pull somebody down without even realizing it, right? So it's going to force you to look inward. And if you can start to see where somebody's headspace is, you can be a good friend from a distance. You can also be a good friend and put parameters like, hey, sure, I'd love to get together for an hour. An hour. We'll hold that hour. Okay. So if you're going to do something, put a parameter there. That's a boundary. Don't leave it free falling like, sure, I'll come over. There's no end goal there. Now you're there and you're like, I'm ready to go. Well, you could still leave. You don't have to like sit there and babysit somebody, but it is important that you understand it. So, but that is the whole theory. So that's why when you see somebody who's negative, sometimes they'll try to feed, if they see somebody else a little negative, they'll try to gravitate towards that person. And while we all want somebody to relate to and be there for, you just can't allow yourself to get sucked into the vortex, because it's very easy to do, because you as a human being are typically somewhat empathetic and you want to be there, and that's fine. But it's when it starts to, when you can almost feel, and you'll know when you're like, how do you know? You'll know. It won't be a once every now and again where it's like, hey, I'm just having a bad day. That's fine. But if every day of that is a bad day, you're going to have to just be able to have the boundary there, because you don't want to get sucked into it. And then that's not protecting your peace, because it's kind of heavy. I don't know if you know somebody who's constantly complaining or constantly in a negative space, like all the time, but it's exhausting, right? It's exhausting. And you're allowed to feel your feelings, and you're allowed to not be in a good headspace, but you're not allowed to project that upon other people. Yes, people can be there, and it's not their responsibility to heal you, but they can be there and they can listen to you. But just make sure that you're not looking for a solve. You're just looking to say, hey, and kind of present that like, hey, I'm not looking for a solve. I think I just need to vent it. I just need to have somebody hear me. You're not necessarily looking for feedback. And if you want feedback, tell them that ahead of time so they know what they're doing, right? So that's a little bit on the misery loves company. And that's why you want to always be careful of what you're surrounding yourself with, because every day is not going to be fabulous. Every day isn't going to be great for everybody, you included. But you just got to be careful of not sucking other people into that vortex and allowing yourself to get sucked into that, because it's going to become super problematic.